most guys out there don't fully embrace their masculinity because of this overarching social message that masculinity is dangerous and harmful. And so a lot of guys are scared of it because we know what happens, right? If I let out a battle cry, you know, the cops are being called, right? My neighbors think I'm crazy. Or if I go and beat my chest and like, you know, I just go crazy, you know, people start to get concerned.
What is the definition of masculinity? The definition of masculinity is a series of traits in relationship to femininity. That's the definition. So that's kind of a very vague definition. And what it's saying is that these two things are reflections of each other, that you cannot have one without the other, just as a tool of communication. Like that's what it comes down to, using these words to communicate certain attributes and traits. Now, there's definitely a difference between femininity, masculinity, and born gender, right? Because you can have certain traits, but be of a different biological gender. So decoupling that work, I think, is really important. I think David Data was one of the first people I came across that helped me understand those differences. Same with Jung. He was really trying to see that these attributes are separate from your biology. Now, when you look into those attributes, I think it has changed a lot in different cultures and different times. So I don't want to say that this is what masculinity is. I would say more of this is what our culture, or this is what at this point in time, masculinity means to our culture and to me, right? Cool. So it's a construct that we use to explain these differences. And currently, at least in my own life, I come back to that, the classic thing that I learned from David Data about you can look at femininity as the experience. I loved what he said once, where femininity is the ocean which is full of life and endless and this huge, massive, powerful place. And masculinity is the boat. So if you want to get anywhere, a boat is where you want to be, right? You want to get from point A to point B, the boat's going to get you there. But which one's more powerful, right? The ocean will swallow you whole easily without a second thought. Sure. So I just love that difference between kind of emotional experience versus consciousness, right? And movement and action.
So to be specific, what would be some of those qualities you would assign to masculinity and femininity? And I know that it's constantly changing, but for you, because you do a lot of this work, so I'm interested in what you qualify masculinity as.
Yeah, so I've been diving into this question a lot. And for me, what's been shifting is actually trying to embody the feeling. So what I mean by that is I'll do this meditation, and this whole thing that I do with Hero Rise and this archetype deck started with an invocation. I wrote this invocation about different attributes of masculinity, and at the end of it, I would sit there. And when I sat there, I would just try to feel what masculinity was in my body. And it was a very different feeling. And that feeling was like a strength of grounding, like just really grounded, really present. And my consciousness was able to perceive the room, the walls, the space in a very grounded, I would say almost mundane, like physical way that made me feel totally centered. That to me is what feels like masculinity. Where femininity, that type of feeling comes up a lot for me in dance, in movement. It's not so much about perfectly being still and perceiving my room. It's more of like, ooh, what's this cool thing I can move with or play with, or what are my senses experiencing and how can I interact with this space? So when I get into that energy, it's much more of dancing, movement, playfulness, that type of experience.
So it sounds like you've migrated away from putting specific characteristics or qualities to assigning them to masculinity or femininity. Is that correct? Am I hearing you that way?
So by qualities, do you mean like
because I think of masculinity as being direct, being focused, being anchored in logic, whereas femininity for me is more loose, more emotional, more free flowing, not as rigid, more flexible. The qualities like that would.
Totally. I completely agree with those qualities. Those are great examples. I just found when I think of the qualities, it's hard to connect to it. But when I feel it in my body, when I actually take the time to like center in that experience, it's just way more palpable. It's just more useful for me. It becomes a gauge of when I'm in my masculinity or not.
Yeah.
Right. Because I can feel the shift.
And I'm fascinated by that because first of all, you're the first person who's ever said that. Said, I'm kind of I'm taking it to like 3.0 here of how we use these distinctions. How does one embody the feeling of masculinity or femininity without being clear on what they are? Or maybe that's a prerequisite.
Yeah, I think the traits that you were saying are a great first step, right? There's tons of charts of like, here's feminine energy, here's masculine energy. Just seeing those is really helpful. But for me, when I just think things, when I'm coming only from the mind, it only goes so far. Mm-hmm. So then you could sit down and you can say, okay, I'm going to read these masculine traits. Now I'm just going to try to feel like what it would be to be in that state. Like, what is the state of action? What does it, what happens to my shoulders? Do they round in? Do they open up? When I am conscious of my settings, what do I feel like? And then that can become a better barometer in the moment, right? As compared to a list of ideas.
Interesting. Okay, cool, man. I dig that. I think that's really cool. And I know I've been to a number of workshops and trainings where in order for men, especially with men's workshops, those are the most ones I've been to, for men to embody their masculine, they invite men to get into their masculine. A lot of times I see that most guys out there don't fully embrace their masculinity because of this overarching social message that masculinity is dangerous and harmful. And so a lot of guys are scared of it because we know what happens, right? If I let out a battle cry, the cops are being called, right? My neighbors think I'm crazy. Or if I go and beat my chest and like, I just go crazy, people will start to get concerned. So I like that you're bringing that piece in.